Our next keynote speaker of the day is Sunil Bhatia. Sunil is an internationally known professor in psychology and human development. His book publications include American Karma, Race, Culture and Identity in the Indian Diaspora, and Decolonizing Psychology, Globalization, Social Justice and Indian Youth Identities. The latter one received the William James Book Award from the American Psychological Association. Sunil has published way over 50 articles and book chapters and received many awards, one among them the APA's 2017 Theodore Sarbin Award for Distinguished Contributions to Psychology. What is more, Sunil is also a fellow Clark University graduate, and even though he left before I arrived, he has been a distant and always available guide for me throughout my studies and also afterwards. It is therefore a distinct pleasure for me to leave this stage, or screen if you want to, and ask Sunil to speak about the pandemic as a mirror, race, poverty, and racial care in times of crisis. Sunil?
It is a real honor to be invited to this conference. I want to begin by thanking Martin Dege and the entire conference committee of the PGC conference. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. I want to start my presentation by sharing the title and the overview of my remarks. The title of my presentation is The Pandemic as Reflection, Race, Poverty, and Radical Care in the Times of Crisis. There are 4 parts to my presentation. I'll first begin talking about my positionality, specifically my positionality, my body, myself, and my mind in relation to the unfolding pandemic. Second, I will speak about decolonizing psychology as a framework, just shedding some light on why it would be helpful for us to think about the pandemic through the lens of decolonizing psychology. Third, I'll speak about specifically the connection between the COVID-19 pandemic and the psychology of racial inequalities and poverty. And finally, I'll end my talk by talking about radical care in the context of this pandemic. The Nigerian-American writer Teju Cole recently published an essay in NY Times that I think is apt for this moment. He says, we can't comprehend this much sorrow. History's first draft is always wrong, but we still have to try and write it. This pandemic is a moment that points to profound loss that is felt through thousands of deaths, social distancing, family suffering, financial insecurity, loneliness, deterioration of mental health, rise of collective anxiety, fear, and rage. So this is my modest and somewhat hurried attempt to comprehend this much sorrow. Let me start with the role of theory in these times. The poet Adrian Rich writes that theory can be a dew that rises from the earth and collects in the rain cloud and returns to the earth over and over. But if it doesn't smell of the earth, isn't good for the earth. One of the questions that's preoccupied me during the pandemic is how do we make theory the dew that rises from the earth and gives back to the earth? More specifically, how can we make psychology dewy and muddy like the earth, and importantly for the earth? Another way of asking this question is how psychology as a discipline can help us understand this crisis. Having said that, I feel the crisis feels too abstract and generic in this moment. What I know for sure is how we define the meaning of the crisis. It depends on who's succumbing to the crisis and which lives are at risk and who gets to tell the story of their suffering or the risk. So to me, the psychology of this crisis is the psychology of asymmetric suffering. I have the means to row my boat away from the storm. I can keep my boat at bay while others have to pass through the storm every day. Having the space to write and think about the pandemic from the comfort of my home feel safe, but yet very distant. I have numbness, I have distant grief, but I've not cried or wept incessantly as one does in the throes of deep loss. But I do know there is extraordinary grief and pain out there. I read about loss and death in papers every day. The New York Times has just published all names of 100,000 Americans who have died due to COVID that you can see on the screen. My maximum worry right now in this moment is I will not be able to be with my elderly mother in India if she succumbs to COVID or becomes COVID positive. I imagine her lonely death. I won't be there for her last rites. I'm living my lockdown life, somewhat anticipating loss, death, and threats from the virus. I anticipate mourning. The crisis has locked me down, but it has not threatened my livelihood or my life. I know there are millions of low-wage, essential frontline workers who are paid minimum wages and who don't have healthcare themselves, and yet are risking their lives to provide care for COVID patients. If you're especially living in the United States and you're from the Navajo Nation or a Latino and African American community, the virus is likely to hit you hard on every front. As I write this introduction, a photograph of an Indian daily wage worker, Ram Pukar Pandit, is going viral. The photo shows him in pain and anguish, sitting on the side of the road in Delhi, speaking to his wife about their sick 11-month-old son. Given the lack of public transportation, he told a reporter that he started walking towards his home in Bihar, which is a 745-mile trip. Exhausted and hungry, he stopped at a bridge until he could not go any further. He said, all I want is to go home and see my son. His well-wishers intervened and arranged for transportation, but several hours later, he learned that his son had died. A few days later, when he reached his village, he said, the rich will get all the help getting rescued and brought home in planes from abroad, but we poor migrant laborers have been left to fend for ourselves. That is the worth of our lives. He says in Hindi, Hum mazduron ka koi desh nahi hota. We laborers don't belong to any country. As of today, this disease has claimed the lives of 346,000 people. These were people just like us, some older, some younger, some well-known, others who have lived ordinary lives. There are many other agonies this disease has extracted. The poor from around the world are dying from hunger, loneliness, exhaustion, and housing insecurity, on top of other pre-COVID diseases like malaria, typhoid, diarrhea. One common sentiment we hear from workers employed in the informal economy around the world is that starvation will kill them before the coronavirus. If the pandemic were a mirror, it would show us the worst cruelties of our socially unequal system. Our disregard and contempt for lives of poor, racism that kills, and an economy that's run on an economy of disposable bodies. Now, let me return to the question I posed before. How do we make sense of this crisis? The Indian laborer, Ram Pukar, asks us to consider what is the worth of his life? What is the worth of his son's life? He asks us whose lives are considered disposable in this crisis. One way to answer Ram Pukar's question is perhaps to ask another question: whose lives did we consider worthy before the pandemic? Whose lives are given importance in our discipline? I want to be more specific given the theme of the conference, the psychology of global crises. What does psychology as a discipline tell us about the psychology of the global crises? It is important to remember that the psychology of the global crisis is different from the discipline of psychology. If you look at the history of mainstream Euro-American psychological science, the lives of people like Ram Pukar Pandit have been invisible, erased, and they don't usually have a voice in the canon of psychology. There are between 300 and 400 million people like Ram Pukar in India and over 2.3 billion people around the world who live their lives very precariously in an informal economy, making less than $2 or $3 a day. And about over 1 billion people live in extreme poverty. Psychology has largely been unable to understand the daily crisis the majority of the world has had to live with before the pandemic. The discipline as a whole has not been able to speak significantly about the larger problems of chronic hunger, underemployment, lack of sanitation, and the prevalence of other diseases such as diarrhea, malnutrition, malaria, and so on. So what faith do we have now that psychology can understand and explain the deep social inequalities or the crises that this pandemic is reflecting back? If the pandemic is a mirror, every social divide and fragility of our life has been exposed and made vulnerable. I'm not arguing that psychology is responsible for solving these long-standing problems of racial inequality, and poverty, but rather the discipline needs to seriously engage with how power, history, politics, and race are constituted in the questions of identity formation, subjectivity, self, and community. Confronting psychology's legacy with colonialism and racism will allow us to bring attention to the racial and ethnic disparities in physical and mental well-being that the pandemic has revealed. I believe psychology suffers from cultural amnesia. One of the questions that I'm thinking about now is how can a psychology that positions itself as universal, ahistorical, apolitical, neutral, scientific, can provide insight into a pandemic suffering that's deeply historical, political, social, and has revealed multiple inequalities across race, ethnicity, class, and geographies. The question of whose lives have value, whose lives are worthy, whose lives merit attention, and whose lives merit inquiry have animated much of my scholarship for 2 decades. I have argued recently in my book, Decolonizing Psychology, that we need an inclusive psychology that speaks to and is relevant to the majority of lives of the world. Decolonizing Psychology then sheds light on how Euro-American scientific psychology has become the standard bearer of psychology around the world. Whose stories get told, what knowledge is considered as legitimate, whose idea of development is considered ideal, and whose lives are considered central to the future of psychology, and whose lives are misrepresented and written out of the canon of psychology. When I was invited to speak to the conference, I wondered how a decolonizing perspective can speak to the ways in which COVID-19 is disproportionately killing African Americans and other people of color. The racial data is still emerging and the picture is not complete here, but early reports are shining a light on racial disparities in the pandemic. Kianga Yamata Taylor, an African American scholar, begins a recent essay titled The Black Plague with the following words. In the African aphorism, when white America catches a cold, black America gets pneumonia, has a new morbid twist. When white America catches the novel coronavirus, black Americans die. Every death, whether it's black or white, or from poor or developing nations, is a tragedy that we must mourn. But what the mirror of the pandemic is revealing is that COVID-19 has a color line, and it is disproportionately ravaging black and brown and working class communities. Before I turn my remarks on race and the pandemic, let me dwell for a moment on what decolonizing psychology means. Let me make that clear to the audience. And this brings me to the second part of my presentation. I also want to say a little bit about what specifically motivated me to write Decolonizing Psychology. There are 356 million Indian youth, and their narratives are barely visible in the field of psychology and human development. We have a psychology that is based on 5% of the human population, but it has the power to speak on behalf of 95% of humanity. During my research, I wondered why close to 1 billion people who live in India and 356 million Indian youth barely feature in psychological studies. And I wondered why their stories are not considered worth telling. I wondered why the psychological canon that I'd studied in India and the US was largely taught from a colonial and Eurocentric lens. Writing Decolonizing Psychology in some ways was deeply personal. I was confronting my own internal colonialism as the toxic psychic legacies of the empire lives in me. The British used psychological and social science knowledge to justify their description of my ancestors as animals, rude, backward, lazy, ignorant. And British Prime Minister Churchill called them a beastly people with a beastly religion. Yet my 7 years of study of psychology in Indian universities drilled into me that British European theories of people and culture and their methods of inquiry were more correct, legitimate, superior to Indian culture and history. Then once again, I encountered this colonial psychology in another benevolent form, and I migrated to study in the US in the 1990s. There, the racism in psychology was subtler and more covert. I was fortunate to be exposed to new fields of culture and narrative psychology in my graduate school. But my racial consciousness taught me something deeper. Eurocentric models of human development had largely reinforced a narrative that people of color had a deficient humanity. They did not belong in the psychological canon, and their stories did not matter in the media or curriculum. The psychology I had encountered in my graduate school in India and the US was largely built on colonial knowledge, universalistic principles, and Eurocentric cultural assumptions about individuality and rationality. It was a local psychology based on a small percentage of population, but yet it had the power to universally define the social and emotional development of all of humanity. There was something wrong with this picture. I did not find my story or the story of people living in Africa and Asia in the canons of psychology. Thus, decolonizing psychology is an attempt to rewrite a narrative of psychology from the margins. The calls for psychology, decolonizing psychology, has come from many diverse places, geographies, and perspectives. As this PowerPoint shows, I draw on decolonial, post-colonial theory, indigenous psychology, critical psychology, cultural and narrative psychology, as well as I draw on stories from the ground to put together a vision of decolonizing psychology. Thomas Teo calls out psychology's history of waging epistemological violence and Sousa speak about epistemicide as in the literal killing of other ways of knowing. Michel's fine work has put a light on how social justice principles and the concept of critical bifocality can be integrated within psychology and its methods. Linda Twice Smith made us aware of the rampant psychological imperialism in a pioneering work, Decolonizing Method. Martin Barrow, Ignacio Delbles, and Mary Watkins remind us how we need a psychology of liberation from multiple oppressions. Peace Kigwa and Poleng Segalo tell us that decolonizing psychology means interrogating our positionality within our institution as teachers who are race, class, and gendered subjectivities. Glenn Adams and his colleagues and Wade Pickering have highlighted the need for decolonial futures and for more theories to be formulated so they can speak to the lives of the global South. Robert Bashara has argued for epistemic diversity in his recent book. Catriona McLeod, Lou and I've just finished a special issue on decolonial feminism for the journal Feminism and Psychology. This is by no means an exhaustive list of scholars working in critical psychology, but the project of decolonization is expanding and growing. The origins of American psychology, I think, are rooted in the teleological narrative of modernity and identity, and that's where several of the decolonial scholars are really important because they speak about how psychology and other social sciences are part of this moment of modernity. For example, Walter Mignolo speaks about modernity's point of origination is in Europe and the Western civilization is built on the edifice of coloniality. So there is no modernity without coloniality. Decoloniality does not reject the social and ethical progress of modernity, but proposes delinking the process of knowledge production from universality and superiority of Western knowledge. Annabelle Chiano and Walter Mignolo write that decoloniality shows us the darker side of modernity and gives us a glimpse of how knowledge and power was used to colonize, subjugate, and erase the lives of indigenous people and people of color through extraction, subordination, slavery. South African psychologists Kopano Ratale, Josephine Cornell, Sifo Dalmini, Rebecca Hellman, Nick Malherbe, and Nsizwa Titi write that colonialism shaped how people thought of self, other relationships, and community for centuries. And decolonizing refers to the undoing of colonialism, including undoing colonial ways of thinking about social structures, knowledge, relationships, and the self. In a similar way, in psychology, Indian psychologists Nandita Chaudhary and Sujata Sriram have recently described how Eurocentric psychology, in an effort to become scientific and colorblind, has become blinded to understanding how cultures are shaped by colonies, empires, universities, lobbyists, and markets. Ravi Priya, another Indian psychologist, speaks of how farmers in Nandigram, India are suffering due to neoliberal policies, but frequently Western concepts of mental health, trauma, and well-being are being applied to explain harms, psychological harms that are essentially caused by structural breakdowns. China Mills has provided robust critiques of the global mental health moment as well. Like what comes out of the decolonizing psychology field, I would say, is one of the key ideas that is relevant for us, is to inquire into how coloniality shapes the core theoretical and methodological foundations of the discipline of psychology, and at how it shapes everyday cultural practices. Colonialism denotes a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of a nation or people rests on power of another nation, which makes such nation an empire. Coloniality instead refers to long-standing patterns of power that emerge as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. Thus, coloniality survives colonialism. Coloniality is different from colonialism. It is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performances, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and so many aspects of a modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. So I think the concept of coloniality is very instructive in understanding why COVID-19 is causing such a toll in communities of color. I now shift to the third part of my presentation to make links between decolonizing psychology, coloniality, and the current pandemic. Since the onset of the pandemic, I've been thinking about specifically racial coloniality, cultural coloniality, and how that has caused such devastation in African-American communities in the US. South African psychologist Jose Kessie reminds us that the psychology that we know of today as scientific psychology was born out of a colonial and apartheid system. Academic psychology, she notes, were complicit in producing knowledge that aided in the oppression of Black people. She notes, categories of race were salient and instrumental in producing various forms of oppression, often legitimized through academic work. And she further highlights that epistemic justice in our context cannot be divorced from an understanding of Black condition. So the structure of racial coloniality lives through the policies, theories, practices, institutions that have been institutionalized and objectified in everyday life. So talking about this transformation from subject to object, Fanon in 1952 writes, "I came to the world imbued with the will to find meaning in things, my spirit filled with the desire to attain to the source of the world. And then I found that I was an object in the midst of other objects. It is hard to make sense of Black suffering, the Black condition or Black racial identity in the context of COVID without connecting it to American concept of structures and racism that has unfolded historically over 200 years. So now I rely here on a brief essay that scholars Cornell Gordon, Walter Johnson, Jason Purnell, and Jamala Rogers have recently published in Boston Review. One of their arguments is that COVID-19 and the ensuing death of African Americans are tragedies, but they're not accidents. Furthermore, they write that African American communities, especially in the city of St. Louis, Missouri, have been delivered to this disease by their history. Very specifically, they write by US history. And think about it again, what they're making the argument that African American communities have been delivered to this disease by their history, by US history. When I read this article, the phrase being delivered to disease by history and through so slow violence stayed with me. I felt unsettled, I felt rage, I felt sad. And then as I continued to think about it and read the essay, this particular excerpt stood out for me. The author is right. In St. Louis, as in the country at large, the deadly disparities of the pandemic are as unsurprising as they're unsettling. It is not simply that African Americans in St. Louis, as in the rest of the United States, have been left behind and thus set in the way of the virus. They've been offered up by history of a racist privilege and profiteering, from prisons to poor neighborhoods, from persistent segregation to willful policy failure. Notice the difference between have been left behind and being offered up. Offered up means sacrificed with implicit and explicit intention. The emphasis the authors make is on willful policy failure. This is where the concept of racial coloniality becomes important in understanding how COVID-19 essentially has become an autopsy report on American racism. The authors begin by noting some figures. For example, Milwaukee County accounts for 27% of the overall population for African Americans, but represents over 50% of the COVID-19 cases. Another example they cite is from the state of Illinois, where African Americans make up 15% of the population, but represent 33% of the COVID cases and 40% of the COVID deaths. In Georgia, African Americans make up 37% of the population, but 62% of COVID deaths. The most glaring statistic emerges from the city of St. Louis, where Americans are 47% of the population, but consist of almost 3/4 of COVID cases. The Guardian recently reported that more than 20,000 African Americans and about 1 in 2,000 of the entire Black population in the US have died from the disease. Behind the statistics, though, there are stories that personalize the suffering of people who have died in this pandemic. New York Times, for example, reported a story of an African American employee named Annie Grant, 55, who worked at a poultry plant in Georgia for over 15 years. She had fever for 2 nights in a row, and her children pleaded her to stay home. Annie's children received a text from their mother that she had to report to work. The reporter states, but on the 3rd day she was ill, the children got a text from their mother. They told me I had to come back to work, the text read. Annie then became progressively ill and died in the hospital while fighting for her life on a ventilator. These were the same essential workers whose lives were never considered critical, vital, or essential, and were ironically being told now by our vice president how important their bodies were in the time of this pandemic. Cornell Gordon and his co-authors give us specific details that show how the disproportionate number of COVID-19 deaths are connected to American history, practices, and policies. Here is what they say that's really important for us to consider as we make the link between racial coloniality and the pandemic in African American communities. The slow violence that we see unfolding in St. Louis has been structured into the fabric of the city, built brick by those who have sought profit in segregation and comfort in social distance. Its racialized patterns of disadvantage are the result of decades of conscious choices by actors at every level of government, aided and abetted by private industries like banking, insurance, and real estate, to name a few. St. Louis's history of imposed Black deprivation is both unique to it and reflective of the broader patterns that have made COVID-19 a channel house for Black Americans nationwide. Cornell Gordon and his colleagues further argue that white citizens have practiced residential social segregation and social distancing for over a century. A racial zoning laws was passed by a popular vote in 1916, which was overturned on equal protection grounds. But the city's realtors, developers, and homeowners found other ways to impose racial restrictions into property deeds and covenants that created new white-only neighborhoods. The authors point out that the Uniform Restriction Agreement by the 1930s had specific language that said white people have the right to, in quotations, preserve the character of the said neighborhood as a desirable place of residence for persons of Caucasian race, end quote. And further stating that homeowners could not, in quotations, erect, maintain, operate, or permit to be erected, maintained, or operated any slaughterhouse, junk shop, or rat picking establishment, or sell, convey, lease, or rent to a Negro or Negroes. Cornell Gordon and his co-authors further highlight in their essay that developers could demand more money by promising white renters and new homeowners that Black people won't be in their neighborhoods. On the other side of the tracks, where majority Black people live, developers and landlords could extract premium rents because the African American population was expanding through the Great Migration. Even after the courts deemed that restricted racial covenants were illegal, segregation continued. Colonel Gordon and his colleagues point out that racial inequality as a form of racial distancing was instituted through federal preferences. And I quote them at length here. Increasingly, it took the form of federal, state, and local subsidies that were in reality available almost exclusively to whites. For example, GI Bill housing benefits available to white veterans and Federal Housing Association loan guarantees distributed according to racist protocols in a pattern that has come to be known as redlining. Even today, the authors note that the city is largely segregated by white and black neighborhoods. They point to the combination of federal partiality, municipal collusion, and that was state sanctioned by the different governments of Missouri. As a Confederate and slaveholding state, Missouri resisted taxes on property, and the result was the state's inability to provide viable public goods and services to its most vulnerable citizens. As a result, the authors argue Missouri has bare-bones social safety net that has underfunded education, reduced unemployment and federal benefits, such as cash assistance programs, and the state has recently refused to expand Medicaid coverage under the Affordable Care Act. I've summarized the key terms and phrases that appear several times in the essay, and it helps us understand how the psychology of the COVID crisis is connected to deep roots of history, culture, practices, policies, and larger perceptions of race and racial suffering. So here are some of the words that I think would be helpful for us to reflect and mull over 2.5 centuries of policy and practice. Whiteness as a creed and domination, state subsidy of whiteness, federal subsidies of white flight. African Americans are 12 times more likely than whites to live in concentrated poverty in that region. Slavery, Jim Crow, and continued black vulnerability. Tax policy skewed toward white gain. Living with environmental toxins. Crumbling sanitary structure. Redlining. Racial disparities in mass incarceration. Climate of abuse and impunity. Police brutality. Law poses mortal danger to young black men. Lack of social services, decent schools, and nutritious foods. African Americans have low wages, long commutes, and fewer benefits. Zip codes and crushed streams, and lack of social mobility. Being stuck in place. Large racial disparities in any index of social well-being, including health, wealth, mental health. Delivered to COVID as a disease by US history. This is a picture of racial coloniality. Our institution, administrations, practices, laws, education emerged from these colonial structures and powers. COVID is a reminder that we breed racial coloniality. What I've attempted here is to show a decolonizing perspective. It helps us in filling the missing pieces in the narrative of psychology. It also shows how settler colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, and historical legacies impacted the experiences of people of color. And they were largely left out of this narrative of psychology, a complicated, messy narrative of psychology. This is what South Santos has called the sociology of absences. The psychology of COVID crisis can be better understood as a story of absences and forgetting, cultural amnesia. So let me refresh what racial coloniality means. In a classic article, Annabel Quijano writes, in America, the idea of race was a way of granting legitimacy to the relations of domination imposed by the conquest. After the colonization of America and the expansion of European colonialism to the rest of the world, the subsequent constitution of Europe as new identity needed the elaboration of a Eurocentric perspective of knowledge. A theoretical perspective on the idea of race as a naturalization of colonial relations between Europeans and non-Europeans. Historically, this meant a new way of legitimizing the already old ideas and practices of relations of superiority and inferiority between dominant and dominated. From the 16th century on, this principle has proven to be the most effective and long-lasting instrument of universal social domination. The racial toll of COVID-19 then can be connected to this age-old story of racial coloniality and oppression. One dimension of the psychology of the current crisis is rooted in long-standing racial crisis and the question of whose life is considered worthy and whose lives have always mattered. It is not just African Americans, but other underrepresented groups such as Asian Americans are facing a wave of intense racism, verbal abuse, physical attacks since the outbreak of the pandemic. On May 26th, over 100 writers, many of them Asian and Asian American, have written a letter calling for an end to the rise of anti-Asian racism and sentiment. They write, the surge in hate crimes, violence, and verbal assaults against Asians and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in recent months is a painful reminder that racism, bigotry, and xenophobia are persistent challenges in the United States. Many of these attacks have been brazen, occurring in public spaces and online. The letter describes Trump's racist language use in phrasing COVID-19 as a foreign Chinese virus, and the subsequent rise of the xenophobic incidents against Asians and Asian Americans. Since March, the nonprofit Stop AAPI Hate has recorded over 1,800 reports of anti-Asian American racist acts that include spitting, stabbing, and shunning. Historians have pointed out that similar racial attacks have been launched against Asian Americans during economic downturns and other public health crises. So decolonizing psychology is concerned with telling a story, filling a story of racialized self, subjectivity, and identity when the politics of disposability are at work. So now I want to offer some concluding thoughts on what radical care means in this time. If the pandemic is a mirror, the cruel system it reflects back is perhaps even hard for the mirror to take. The mirror might crack from the heaviness of its own reflection. So what does care, empathy, and social action mean in these times of cracked mirrors and heightened racial inequality and xenophobia? I've been thinking of late about what radical care of self and community looks like from a decolonizing perspective. So to conclude my thoughts on radical care, in a recent article titled Radical Care, Hobart and Neese defined the meaning of care. Theorized as an effective connective tissue between an inner self and an outer world, care constitutes a feeling with rather than a feeling for others. When mobilized, it offers visceral, material, and emotional heft to acts of preservation that span a breadth of localities, selves, communities, and social worlds. Radical care is then feeling with others, being in solidarity with others. It means sharing the same risk as others. It means visceral, material, and emotional support for those whose lives has always been under threat, and now their lives look even more precarious than before. One way to think of radical care is to rewrite the American racial contract in which white lives have been typically considered more valuable than non-white lives. Keeanga Yamata Taylor's book From Black Lives Matters to Black Liberation argues that the basic principle of radical care is Black liberation. She writes, while it is true that when Black people get free, everyone gets free, Black people in America cannot get free alone. In that sense, Black liberation is bound up with the project of human liberation and social transformation. Radical care means rethinking the racial contract and simultaneously engaging in social transformation of the neoliberal order. It means undoing the coloniality of racial hierarchy and racial terror and dismantling what Carol Anderson calls white rage and white supremacy. The writer for The Atlantic, Adam Serwer, writes that the pandemic has exposed whose lives have greater value. He says that the implied terms of this racial contract have always been visible, and I quote him at length. Struggling white farmers in Iowa taking billions in federal assistance are hardworking Americans down on their luck. Struggling single parents in cities using food stamps are welfare queens. Black Americans struggling in the cocaine epidemic are a bio-underclass created by a pathological culture. White Americans struggling with the opioid addiction crisis are a national tragedy. Poor European immigrants who flocked to an America with virtually no immigration restrictions came the right way. Poor Central American immigrants evading a baroque and unforgiving system are gang members and terrorists. The coronavirus epidemic, he says, has rendered the racial contract visible in multiple ways. Once the disproportionate impact of the epidemic was revealed to the American political and financial elite, many began to regard the rising death toll less as a national emergency than as an inconvenience. Cornell Gordon and his co-authors reinforce Server's point when they state that people of color have been offered up by history to this disease. Rewriting the racial contract means abolishing white supremacy and creating equality in social, economic, and political spheres. I believe that for a very long time, an unbridgeable cleavage has existed between psychology and principles of social justice because of psychology's embrace of colorblind ideology. Psychology has not yet developed a meaningful theoretical vocabulary or a willingness to explore questions of social justice that are wrapped around internalized racism and racial dominance and racial coloniality. Radical care means undoing that psychology. Radical care means then undoing the coloniality of psychology. It means undoing the neoliberal order and providing radical care of decent wages, education, protection to frontline workers who are delivering care in this crisis. Immigrants, working class people, people of color, nurses, daily wage earners, laborers, janitors, grocery store workers, and all of those people who need to be cared while they are sustaining life and life for us and the society at large. Radical care can simply mean putting a spotlight on the psychology of racism involved in the pandemic. We may not have the answers, we may not have all the answers, but unless there's a collective will to speak about racism, psychology is in the danger of contributing to its colonial legacy. Radical care means rethinking how psychology is complicit in creating an ideology of neoliberalism that is now accepted as common sense. In this model, self-narratives are fashioned through neoliberal discourses and psychological discourses about happiness and optimism and well-being and creativity and corporate forms of globalization that often encourage employees to embrace the tenets of positive psychology for maximizing their happiness, their productivity, and their efficiency. At the simplest level, radical care in decolonizing psychology means focusing on people and not profits. And this might be one of our ways to manage the precarity of life in our immediate and future crises. Thank you for listening, and I'll take questions from the participants.